Hello, I'm Full Paragon, and this is your dungeon guide for the Anniversary Lightning and Dark Dungeon. I'm going to go through a couple of different teams. The first one is what I consider to be the easy mode team. The key characters for both these runs are, to no one's surprise, going to be Godqua and Legendary Darkness. Both of these characters are incredibly strong, and they're going to make your dungeon runs really easy. If you want to just cheese the dungeon, the simplest way to do it is to put Darkness as the tank, have Legendary Aqua in the second slot, and then use a relevant healer or DPS. For the lightning side, El Silo will definitely be an amazing option. You can also try characters like Leah, Chris, or Mitsurugi, but that team will get you through with just a little bit of heartache. Easier though, I think, is using Mitsurugi as the tank, Godqua as your support, and then El Silo as a DPS/healer, because that just makes this dungeon really, really simple. Your other tank alternative here is to use a Lightning Leah. Leah is the best bet, but Swimsuit Leah will also work. I'm going to try this team out, and as you'll see, this dungeon run goes pretty smooth. The most important thing to remember is the first floor is basically your opportunity to farm some gauge and keep your characters healthy. If your characters are weakened, you'll either have to switch someone out or risk having someone dying, so it's best to keep everyone as close to topped up health as possible. In this run, I kinda screwed up. I should have banked some more actions and left one of the little enemies alive for longer. It ultimately didn't matter in this run, but if you're struggling, try and save up 2 actions on each character before dealing the final blow. Make sure that your characters are close to top off, and as many of their abilities are off cooldown as possible, and you'll have a much easier time on the second floor. Potions are really important in Dungeon. I've mentioned this before, but the best ones are the Super Gauge Fill Rate Potion and the Agility Up Potion. Since I saw a Super Gauge Fill Up Potion here, I chose it. Make sure you're choosing the one that lasts the whole dungeon, as this is just the first floor. Alright, the second floor is where things start to get tricky. That troll can deal a lot of damage, and that snail can be disruptive. Make sure that you have your team as close to full as possible from the first floor. Have a couple of actions saved up. If you need to, you can swap to Leah as a tank. She's pretty good at absorbing damage, but because I saved up some gauge, I'll be ready to go. Do try and keep everyone healthy. Remember, you're going to use El Silo and Mitsurugi when you get to the last floor dragon. The second floor is where things can get a little tricky. The snail can be really disruptive with debuffs, while the troll deals a lot of damage. Take out the snail first, as it's easier to deal with long-term damage from the troll than the debuffs that the snail will give out. Here I had Mitsurugi ult right away, healing my team up as well as providing that ever-important buff. Then I went to town on the troll. I tried to make sure that I had gauge and skill cooldowns ready when I cleared this floor. I knew that Mitsurugi and El Silo were going to be used next on that final floor against the dragon, while Godqua is going to be used on every floor, so I wanted to make sure she was ready to support the next team. Overall, this floor isn't too hard. Make sure you're prepared, and with an eye to the future, you'll easily clear it and be ready for the next part. Ultimately, I got pretty lucky here in potion selection, as I got that Super Gauge Boost potion. Even though my team that I had just used was ready to use most of its supers, the team I was preparing to take into the dark half of the dungeon wasn't. Getting them prepped to use their supers right away made this run much smoother. Don't be afraid to take Super Gauge Boost or health potions early on if it will mean a smoother run. It might seem odd at first glance that the team I went with for the dark half of the dungeon was Legendary Darkness as a tank, Godqua as a support, and Mia as another support/DPS, but Mia's agility down complements Godqua and Legendary Darkness's kits very well. She has a heal and gauge up, while Darkness mitigates a lot of damage and actually deals quite a bit of damage with the mask ult, and Godqua keeps everyone healthy. The only real thing you have to watch out for on this floor is that the Goblin can use its big single target attack against Godqua. If that happens, she is at risk of death if she's not already at full health. But that's a fairly low chance. I got lucky here and didn't have to do any resets. Darkness and Mia provided tons of damage, Godqua kept everyone healthy, and I made sure to farm up gauge and get my skill cooldowns ready to go on the next floor, which is a little bit harder. Pretty easy overall. This time I went with a damage boost potion. It's not the best, but I didn't need any HP recovery, and it would have been a big waste to get that 20 agility so early on in the dungeon. It was still helpful, and overall my dungeon run was still pretty smooth. Going into this floor, I took a bit of a risk as Darkness was already pretty battered and bruised, and the wizard deals mostly magic damage, which Legendary Darkness isn't as good at mitigating. Still, because I had a full Mia gauge, I was fairly confident I'd be able to slow the enemies down, then get Darkness back up to full health before I was any real danger from dying. Thanks to an early Mia ult, this floor ended up being pretty easy. That tier 3 agility down really gives you the time that you need to think things through and make sure that you're able to keep your team alive. I did use Luna here. It was probably a bit of overkill, but I really wanted to play things safe on this floor and make sure that I had a character death at the end and still be able to get a 4-star rating. Overall, this is probably one of the harder floors, especially since there isn't a really great option for a synergistic dark team at this point in time, but you can still get through with Legendary Darkness and Godqua and a little bit of help from Mia. This was probably the hardest potion selection I had. All of these options are really great. Ultimately though, I went with the 50% physical damage boost. That's just so massive, and since most of my team already deals physical damage, I thought that would be the best option for quickly and efficiently clearing the last floor. Thanks to my planning ahead of time, my team was totally ready to take on that dragon. Having full gauge and nearly full health on everyone was going to make this fight much easier. Still, I made sure to put Leah in at the rear 4 slot just in case. The big blue dragon does a lot of AoE damage, and it will also inflict your team with poison. This can be deadly, so make sure the team that you're going in with has a plan to deal with it. For me, my plan was quite simple. Lots and lots of healing from Aqua, Mitsurugi, and of course, El Silo. I was also able to deal a significant amount of damage with my team, thanks to that physical damage buff, and the fact that I had tier 3 attack buffs ready to go. Still, this boss can be quite deadly. I was perhaps a little bit over-aggressive in using heals when I didn't have to, and in the end, Mitsurugi ended up dying. Still, because I'd had a deathless run all the way through, I was able to bring in Leah at the last second and kill the boss and still get a 4-star rating even after losing someone. Real quick, I'll talk about some choices that you have that are welfare options and do pretty well in the dungeon. First off, we have Swimsuit Leah. She's pretty great as far as tanks go. Her agility down is alright and her attack up is alright, but the heal and the fact that her attack is AoE is a pretty decent option. If you're using her with her ult too, she has a great damage cut and an agility buff that can really help you clear the dungeon. Another dark tank you can use is the Welfare Mitsurugi. He has a minor boost to physical defense, but what's really important is that he's of the dark element, will take reduced damage from those light-based enemies, and he is able to soak a lot of damage because of his stats. It really helps to have Entrialed and have his personal weapon, as this really helps to keep Mitsurugi alive. For a healer, it's hard to go wrong with Arabian Silo. She's not bad, and while her Bind Cleanse isn't really relevant in this dungeon, she does a pretty good job of keeping everyone alive. I'll note that El Silo is definitely much better, but this is probably the best option you have for dark healers if you're not going to be using Godqua. And of course, for dark DPS, Dark Rin is definitely worth mentioning. Her attack down is very relevant, as is her self-agility up, and she deals a lot of dark damage. You can equip her either with the Dark Staff, or with an Arena Staff, or with the Goddess Staff. They all work fairly well on her. You can try building a mage team here using characters like Summer Wiz and Lightning Union, but honestly, I think you're better off going with a physically oriented team centered around Godqua and Legendary Darkness. Assuming you don't have them, this dungeon gets much harder, and I encourage everyone to pull for them. Without them, your strategies are going to have to get creative. For those of you who want to see it, here is your Godqua and Darkness-less run of this dungeon. Due to limited tanking options in Dark, I went with Kenpo Leah as I wanted to use Dark Mitsurugi as a tank on the other half of the dungeon. If you don't have Kenpo Leah, Swimsuit Leah works okay, but She doesn't have quite as much DPS, and you might run into timeout issues here. Swimsuit Aqua is basically mandatory to be run alongside El Silo, as without those two characters you're going to run into a lack of gauge up, as well as a lack of healing to keep your team alive. Make sure you're still using Sacred Create Water on Aqua, as ultimately that defense down and additional healing is far more valuable than the piddly damage that God Blow is going to get for you. Again, make sure that your skills are off cooldown, your action bar is full, and your alt gauge is as full as possible when going to the next floor, as without that, the rest of this dungeon run is going to be pretty challenging. I didn't like the potions I saw the first time, but a quick redraw got me the best one, and a long-term agility boost. That's definitely what you want to see on floor 1, and I really got lucky here, and it made the rest of my dungeon run much smoother. Just keep the same team here and head right on to the next floor. If you played your cards right on the first floor, you'll be ready to ult right away, making the second floor significantly easier. Deal with the snail quickly again, and then, once you have the troll in a weak position, get ready for the final boss. Save up your skills and make sure that your action bar is full and have as much ult gauge as possible. This is the team you'll want to use against the final boss, and if you're not prepared, he'll wipe you out quickly. Again, I got lucky here. Super gauge fill rate is exactly what I wanted to see, and I made sure to grab it. PJ Mia is definitely the best dark tank. You can try with Dark Mitsurugi, but he's just not as good as her. He's a good backup, but Mia is definitely what you need in the front slot if you're not using darkness. Arabian Amy is the best dark healer, but El Silo is the real star here. She can be used crossed element, and her buffs are really important for clearing these next two floors. The third floor can be the most dangerous. If you didn't get a super gauge fill potion, you're going in with a team that doesn't have enough alt gauge to use their powerful ultimates to slow the boss down and keep you healthy. Here, I was really saved by El Silo having full ultimate gauge, and her being able to get my team back to full health after taking some hard hits. Quickly take out those two little enemies. It really helps if you have two characters with ultimate gauge fill, and even an agility buff from El Silo, as that will make sure that your team is able to quickly respond and get their buffs going to keep themselves strong. You can try and use Luna to fill a gap here, as she can turn what could have been a disaster into something that isn't quite as bad. The Goblin is also a serious threat. He has a really strong ultimate attack, and if he targets El Silo, he can kill her in just one hit if you get unlucky. Fortunately, that didn't happen to me, but it's something that you might need to reset for if that happens to you. Do your absolute best to farm up some gauge, skill cooldowns, and action bar, as if you go in unprepared on that fourth floor, your team will be in dire straits. More ultimate gauge fill was just what the doctor ordered, as that was going to really help me on these last two floors. El Silo on low health here made my run a little bit harder. I probably should have tried to heal up a little bit harder on that last floor, but ultimately it ended up not mattering. If you go in prepared, this fourth floor should be kind of a breeze, as Mia will be able to slow them down immediately. Things started off pretty well for me. El Silo was able to ult, healing everyone up, and making sure that I had some powerful attack buffs to quickly deal with the spider, while Mila's ultimate slowed both of the enemies down and allowed me to take my time. I probably ended up taking a little bit too much time. If I'd been a little more aggressive, I wouldn't have run into the problem of Amy eating a critical and dying. That was a bit of bad luck for me, but I also very nearly timed out. However, by taking my time, I ensured that El Silo was ready to go for that final floor with her skill cooldowns, gauge, and of course her actions ready to go against that last boss. My last potion selection was really a no-brainer. That big super gauge fill rate boost was incredible against the boss. If you played your cards right, you should be able to go back to the team you used for floor 1 and 2 and have them ready to go for the final boss. This team is pretty synergistic. With Kenpo Leah's damage cut, the gauge fill that you get from Aqua, and the attack buffs that you get from El Silo, you shouldn't have too hard of a time. The only thing you're going to run into is that stacking poison and AoE damage. I got kinda lucky on my potions, which makes this run a little bit easier, but I think even without that massive luck on getting that ultimate gauge boost fill rate increase, this boss is still very doable without Godqua and Legendary Darkness. I really can't stress how important it is to get Legendary Aqua and Legendary Darkness. Even in Japan, there's no characters that surpass Aqua as a cross-element support, and very few that make for a better tank than Darkness, regardless of what dungeon we're talking about. If you have them, long term, it'll be much easier to clear dungeons, as you'll be able to use those two in pretty much every opportunity. Without them, you need a much larger cast of characters to fill the roles that they can. And with 2 4-star dungeon runs, that concludes my video guide. I hope this was of some help to you. I'll have more Konosuba Fantastic Days guides coming soon, including the new tier list with the anniversary units at the end of the month.